So again, thank you all for being here today. Today we're celebrating the life and the work of Mary Leakey. Now, we're not only celebrating her work today, we'll be talking about a couple of other people, well, one other person at least, and something else, but I wanted to focus on Mary Leakey at the beginning because her work is really very important, what she did during her life. Mary Leakey was born on February 6th in 1913 in London. Her parents were Erskine Edward Nicol and Cecilia Nicol. And they moved around a lot. They moved to the United States back and forth. They moved to Italy. They moved to Egypt because her father was a painter of watercolors. And he would go to these places, paint watercolors, and then bring them back and sell them in England. Apparently, he was a semi-successful watercolorist. And she began during those travels as a young girl with her parents to develop an interest in Egyptology, which around that time in the 20s, was kind of a thing. I think we all remember the old movies and everything, right? When people were suddenly discovering ancient Egypt and movies like The Mummy and all those crazy things, right? But she developed an interest in Egyptology. Now, on her mother's side, Mary was the third great granddaughter of a man named Jean Frere. And Jean Frere was a very famous antiquarian, an antiques person, if you will, an antiques dealer. But the Frere family had also been avid abolitionists during the British colonial empire in the 19th century. And they established a number of communities for freed slaves. Three of the communities were still in existence when Mary Leakey published her autobiography in 1984. There was the community in Freetown, Kenya, Freetown, South Africa, and Freetown, India. So I find it interesting that they were so involved in such an effort. And the Nichols spent much of their time in France, where Mary became fluent in French. And when she was 12, they stayed at a commune in the southern part of France, in the Dordogne, called Les Aisies, at a time when the person running that commune was, he was a French archaeologist and a paleontologist, a prehistorian, if you will. And he was excavating out of one of the caves there. And so he wasn't excavating scientifically. He was just, digging because he was trying to find things that he could bring back to museums and sell to museums and everything. And she did receive permission to go through the remnants of his dig that he was doing there. And that's where her interest in prehistory and archaeology really was sparked. She started a collection, in fact, of points and scrapers and blades from the dump, the scree, they call it. And she developed her own system of classifying those. And then when she was 13 years old in 1926, her father died suddenly of cancer. And Mary and her mother returned to London, where her mother placed her in a local Catholic convent school to be educated. And later on in her autobiography, which you can still read today, it's called Disclosing the Past. In her autobiography, she boasts that she never passed an examination there, ever. Even though she spoke fluent French, she didn't excel at French language studies because the professor, the teacher, didn't like the provincial accent that she had. And so she was expelled because she refused to recite poetry. And she was expelled from a second convent school later on because she caused an explosion in one of their laboratories. So she was quite the young, ne'er-do-well, let's say. That's not, she was just her own person. After she got expelled the second time, her mother hired 2 tutors for her. And that didn't work either. So her mother just hired a nanny. And she was raised after that in a very bohemian kind of lifestyle. Today we have what we call helicopter parents. That was not her parent, not her mom. She was raised pretty much, you could do whatever you want. Mary went on to raise her own children like that too, and a couple of her children, a couple of her sons, Richard most prominently, became also a well-known paleontologist. But her real interest focused on illustration and archaeology. Because she wasn't really formally educated, she could never go or be admitted to a university. Her mom tried to get her into Oxford, but the professor that she knew there said, don't even bother trying because it'll waste your time. They're not going to accept her without it. So Mary didn't have any further contact with Oxford until she was awarded an honorary doctorate in 1951. Her mother moved then from London proper to Kensington in West London, where she attended lectures, even though she wasn't registered. She attended lectures in archaeology at the University College and the London Museum. And then in 1934, she took part in a dig at Swanscombe in Great Britain, where she discovered the largest elephant tooth that had ever been found in Britain at that time. Now, when you first hear about that, you say, oh, it's an elephant tooth, but it was the largest one ever found. And here was Mary, with no formal education in archaeology, who discovered it. And then around this time also, she was asked to illustrate a book called Adam's Ancestors, written by Louis Leakey. Now, Louis Leakey was 10 years her senior, but they developed a relationship and they got married in 1937. And from there, history was made. The Leakeys became very famous as a couple, as a paleontologist, a married couple. And during the 30s through the 50s, they worked together in various sites that dug up Stone Age remnants and Neolithic remnants. But the most famous place that they ever worked was at the Olduvai Gorge in the Serengeti Plains in Tanzania. And that gorge yielded a lot of tools and other items from the Neolithic and prehistoric age. The earliest tools that they dug up there together can be dated to over 2 million years ago. Now, I think today we're probably not so astonished when we hear that there were people, there were Homo sapiens people living 2 million years ago who used tools. But when they dug those up, that was quite a find. And then on the morning of July 17th in 1959, Mary went out to the site alone to work because Louis had become ill. And so at some point she found a piece of a bone that she thought might be part of a skull. And after she dusted away the topsoil, she found 2 large teeth that were set in the curve of a jaw. And she became very excited and ran back to the camp and said, I've got him. And they began excavating actively the next day. And although it had to be put together from a lot of fragments, they reconstructed the cranium of this individual, this pre-human who had lived there. And Louis Leakey concluded that it was a species of what's called Australopithecines. Now, I'm going to admit to you, I can't really pronounce most of these names properly anyway, but it was apparently a very significant find. And he eventually dubbed it Zygenthropus boisei, or East Africa man. And Zinj is an ancient Arabic word for the East African coast. Louis died in 1972. And during their years together, most of the discoveries that happened were actually discoveries by Mary that he then presented to the scientific community and to the world and essentially took credit for. And there's debate. In her book, she said that she didn't care about that because she knew that he was the one that had the education and she didn't. So what he said would hold more weight with the scientific community. But there's evidence that later on, toward the end of his life, she was getting a little tired of being put into the shadows, and she started to resist that. And it put a strain on their marriage. So she continued their work after he died. And then she discovered hominid fossils that were 3.75 million years old, almost 4 million years old. They uncovered the hominin footprint trail, which led through some volcanic ash. And she discovered 15 new species of animals and 1 new genus. And she died at the age of 83 in 1996, having a stellar career, even without an education, and at a time when women were still fighting to be recognized in her field of archaeology. And in many ways, they still are. Now, also happening this week, later in the week, on Saturday, we'll be thinking about the 213th birthday of Charles Darwin. We can't really go past his birthday as, I believe, as Unitarian Universalists without thinking about him. And I don't think it's coincidental that, like Mary Leakey's family, on the Frere side, Darwin and his family were also avid abolitionists. Both sides of his family, the Darwins and the Wedgwoods, the famous Wedgwood family, were all Unitarian. And although his grandfather, Erasmus, was a free thinker, he had him baptized as an Anglican, because that's what you did back then, even though they went to Unitarian services. And so he studied religion for a while, and it was thought that he might become an Anglican priest, but he decided not to do that. It's hard to believe, not to believe rather, that Charles would continue to have an interest in religion, right, with such a history. And he did. He continued to have an interest in religion and an interest in bringing the issue of abolition to the world. Mary's work was building on and advancing the purpose of Darwin's work, which was to show that humans evolved from a common primate ancestor. It was all about using reason and science in a meaningful and responsible search for truth and meaning, as our principles and purposes encourage us to do. And yet, even today, we know that this idea scares the bejesus out of some people. And as does anything that challenges a worldview that's based on Bronze and Iron Age notions about the world. This is why we see things like book burnings happening, because people are frightened by ideas that challenge their limited, narrow view of the world. To paraphrase the playwrights Jerome Lawrence and Robert Lee, Leakey and Darwin showed us that in a child's power to master the multiplication table, there's more sanctity than all of their shouted amens and holy holies and hosannas, that an idea is a greater monument than a cathedral, and that the advance of man's knowledge is a greater miracle than all the sticks turned to snakes or the parting of the waters. They took us forward to a hilltop, Leakey and Darwin, from where we could look back and see the way from which we came. But for this insight, say Lee and Lawrence, for this insight and for this knowledge, we have to abandon our faith in the pleasant poetry of Genesis. But as we honor both Leakey and Darwin, who helped us understand our past, we also have to celebrate the advances that science is making now. And one of the most exciting advances in science that I'm really interested in is the James Webb Space Telescope that was launched in December. And it's now 1 million miles away, starting to do the work of sending back images that will change the face of astronomy forever. And I recall looking up in the night sky and seeing a small object moving across that night sky. Maybe you remember this, and it's hard to see now with all the lights we have now, but I remember seeing this. We were living in Union City, and there was a lot of ambient light, but still I remember seeing this small object go across the sky. And I remember my brother telling me that it was a satellite because it wasn't moving exceptionally fast, but it was moving at a pretty steady pace. And I'm not sure what satellite it was, because back then they were small, but they were lower in the atmosphere. And you can still see satellites if you're at a place that has clear visibility on certain nights. That initial launching, though, of the Sputnik satellite, maybe some of you remember it. I barely remember it. It was October 1957. That was an expression of humanity's need to know, the need to reach beyond the limits of an earthbound existence, and the need to know if, in fact, we're alone in the universe. And if there is, in fact, more out there. Not only that we need to know, but if we're connected to it, what it is, what it's made up of, and how we can understand it. And I believe, most importantly, how we can use that knowledge to improve our lives here on Earth. Not many years after Sputnik, the USSR put the first human into space when Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth one time in his Vostok spacecraft. That was on April 12th in 1961. And then a few months later, in February 20th, 1962, we'll note that 2 weeks from now, John Glenn orbited the Earth in his Friendship 7 spacecraft 3 times. I do remember that. And so it began, what we called the space race back then. And with it began the dreams and the imagination of many of us who grew up in that age of space exploration. We grew up imagining and wondering if someday it would really be like it was on TV, on Star Trek. And it would change how we view religion and how we view philosophy and how we view the unity of humanity, right? And it would change our own personal spiritualities in many ways. I mentioned before in previous sermons my excitement of the images sent back by the Hubble Space Telescope. And I kind of feel sorry now for Hubble. Some people are sort of, pushing it into the background, but its work is still continuing and it's still important work. But those images are just mind-blowing to me. And they bring out something in me that I can't quite describe, the beauty of them. Now, the James Webb Telescope is going to be sending us images back from much deeper in space. In fact, it's going to be able to look back almost to what we would call the beginning of time, almost to the Big Bang. It's going to see the birth of stars. It's going to see the atmosphere and the property of exoplanets, those planets that exist outside of our own solar system. And as I said before, I confess that when I read articles about the work of Mary Leakey or Darwin, or about paleontology, or when I read about the James Webb Telescope, I'm on a couple of sites on Facebook where I get constant things about what's going on, and people are so knowledgeable about how it works, and I read those articles, and I'm just both amazed and confused because I have no idea most of the time what they're talking about. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an astronomer. I couldn't tell one hominid fossil from another, and I can barely recognize the names of the stars and all those things that are given out there. And I know it's not just me. I know I'm not alone with that. Maybe some of you have the same feeling, right? So why the fascination? Because no matter how sophisticated humanity has become, we are still in awe of the universe and of our place in it. We're still rightfully held in awe when we look up at the night sky, right? And when we unearth some fossil remains or some shards of pottery or ruins of an ancient city that have been buried under millions of years of dirt and soil. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of just taking a hike in the woods maybe, or being down near the shore and bending over, and maybe you've found an arrowhead that could be maybe a few hundred years old, maybe a few thousand years old. We don't know. How exciting that is for, people, ordinary people like us. Or maybe you've been down near the shore and you found one of those fossilized fish in a small piece of rock. It's very exciting for us. And the more our knowledge advances, the more we find that we have so much more to learn, that our past is inextricably linked with our future, and that there seems to be no end or beginning point anymore, right? And I think Mary Leakey would be just as excited about the James Webb telescope as she would about digging up fossils. The Catholic priest Darmid Omerchu, who's a social psychologist and a lecturer on the subject of evolutionary spirituality and what's called big history, he says this: the evolutionary story requires that we listen attentively to the evolving process transpiring over billions of years. Our failure to attend to this expansive vision may well be the major cause of alienation and estrangement that we often experience in our daily lives. I have grave doubts that the story of evolution can be rescued to one cycle commencing about 12 billion years ago and culminating some 5 to 10 billion years from now. It's all too neat for the creativity of divine becoming. In other words, we have this idea that a few billion years from now, 12 billion years from now, the sun is going to explode and that's it. But that's not the end of evolution. That's just the end of one star. And it wasn't the beginning of one star when our star was created. As people of liberal religious beliefs, we understand the importance of science and we honor it. It's worth repeating what Carl Sagan said in that now famous phrase of his. He says, the nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. That includes those ancient pre-human people, individuals, and primates that existed all those millions and millions of years ago. And whatever humanity will become in the future, it includes them as well. Thinking about that comment always shocks me. It always blows my mind. We are made of star stuff. How incredible it is to understand that everything we are, everything we see around us, everything that has existed and has been created comes from the same source. It comes from the explosion of the core of stars, perhaps trillions of light years ago. Sometimes it's just too much to take. I find it hard to grasp except in a very abstract way. Somewhere out there, this star exploded, and it held in it everything that not only became me, but became you, and it became the computer you're looking at. It became the flowers in your garden, it became my car, it became my neighbor and the clouds. And that's why we honor and celebrate those people like Mary Leakey and Darwin and all those women and men who advance our knowledge and help us to recognize and understand that the interconnectedness of all things means just that. All things, all beings, no exceptions. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.